An attack aircraft A-type is designed primarily to hit targets on the ground. Specifically, it's built for close air support, meaning it flies near friendly troops and hits enemy forces that are mixed in close to them. It can also do interdiction, cutting off enemy supply lines and reinforcements, and sometimes it does straight-up strike missions against fixed targets. What makes an attacker different from a bomber is precision and survivability at low altitude. Bombers fly high and drop big loads. Attackers fly low, get into the dirt, and have to survive anti-aircraft guns, missiles, and all the chaos of a battlefield. So they tend to be armored, maneuverable, and capable of carrying a lot of different weapons. The naming convention itself, using the letter A for attack, became official in the United States in the 1930s. Before that, there was a mess of different systems between the Army Air Corps and the Navy. In 1962, the whole military moved to a unified system, so every branch uses the same A, B, F, C designations now. That's actually why some of these aircraft have numbers that might seem out of order or skip around. When the 1962 system kicked in, old Navy aircraft got redesignated and slotted into the new A-series sequence. Alright, let's go through them one by one. Here's a weird one to start on. The A1 designation in the old Army Air Corps numbering was actually skipped on purpose. The Army wanted to avoid confusion with a plane called the Cox-Clemen A1, which was an ambulance aircraft, so they just started the attack sequence at A2. That said, later, under the 1962 unified system, the designation A1 was used, and for one of the most legendary aircraft in American history. We'll get to that in just a minute. Curtiss Douglas XA-2. This is where the attack designation actually begins. In 1926, the Army Air Corps took a heavily armed version of the Douglas O-2 observation plane and designated it the XA-2, the X standing for experimental. It was basically a biplane with guns. Not exactly revolutionary, but it established the whole attack aircraft category, so it deserves its mention, Curtiss A-3 Falcon. Moving on, the A-3 was a biplane built by Curtiss. It came in a few variants and was used during the late 1920s and into the 1930s. It could carry light bombs and was armed with machine guns. Think of it as the military testing out what a dedicated ground attack plane could look like. It served in fairly limited numbers and was pretty quickly overtaken by newer designs. Curtiss XA-4 and XA-5, these were experimental iterations. The Air Corps was basically trying different configurations to figure out what worked. The XA-4 and XA-5 never went into production. They were test beds more than real combat aircraft. The numbering was moving fast because the Army kept putting out requests and companies kept submitting ideas. Curtiss XA-6 and Atlantic Fokker XA-7, same story. The XA-6 and XA-7 were experimental proposals. The XA-7 was actually designed by a Dutch-American company, Atlantic Fokker, and it looked quite different from the Curtiss entries. Neither made it into production. The interwar years were a real trial and error period. Curtiss A-8 Shrike. Now we're getting somewhere. The A-8 Shrike was a monoplane, a big deal at the time because most aircraft were still biplanes. It was a sleek, low-wing design powered by a liquid-cooled V-12 engine. The A-8 was actually put into limited service with the Army Air Corps in the early 1930s. It could carry light bombs and had forward-firing guns. It wasn't a world beater, but it showed that the monoplane was the future. Detroit Lockheed 1A9, a prototype from Detroit Aircraft Lockheed. Never reached production. The numbering continued to track every proposal, whether it flew in anger or not. Curtiss YA-10. Another Curtiss prototype, these Y prefix aircraft were service test aircraft, meaning the Army was evaluating them for potential service entry, but hadn't committed. The YA-10 didn't make the cut. Consolidated A-11. One of several experimental entries in this era, not widely built. Curtiss A-12 Shrike. This one actually made it into service. The Curtiss A-12 Shrike was an all-metal monoplane and the first U.S. attack aircraft to use a radial engine in this lineage. It entered service with the Army Air Corps and was a genuine step forward in capability. It could carry bombs under its wings and in a small internal bay, and was armed with machine guns. The A-12 served through the mid-1930s. By the standards of its day, it was a capable ground attack platform, though it would be hopelessly outdated within a few years. Northrop YA-13. An experimental design from Northrop, never went into production. Curtiss YA-14. Another service test aircraft. Curtiss was basically the Boeing of attack aircraft at this point, submitting designs for every competition. The YA-14 was a twin-engine design, which was unusual for the attack category at the time. Martin A-15, never produced. Northrop YA-16, never produced. Northrop A-17. Now here's a plane that actually mattered. The Northrop A-17, also known as the Douglas DB-8 for export versions, was a proper production attack aircraft. It had an enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, and it was fairly modern for its era. The A-17 was bought in decent numbers by the Army Air Corps, and was also exported to several countries, including the Netherlands, Peru, and Norway. By the time World War II started, the A-17 was already obsolete for frontline combat, but it represented the maturation of the attack aircraft concept in the US. Curtiss A-18 Shrike. The A-18 was a twin-engine evolution of the Shrike line. It had better performance than the A-12, but arrived at an awkward time. The Army was already moving toward faster designs. Only a handful were built. Vultee YA-19, another prototype that didn't enter service. Douglas A-20 Havoc. Now we're in business. The A-20 Havoc is one of the most important American aircraft of World War II, and it's arguably where the A-series really started earning its reputation. The A-20 was a twin-engine attack bomber. It was fast, over 300 miles per hour, it was heavily armed with forward-firing guns, and it could carry a meaningful bomb load. The British actually flew it before the Americans and called it the Boston. The American version, called the Havoc, was used in many parts of World War II like the Pacific, North Africa, and Europe. It was also sent to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and they really liked it. It was used for low-level strafing runs, skip bombing attacks against ships, and tactical support of ground troops. The A-20 was genuinely dangerous and feared, and it sold in the thousands. Over 7,000 were built. It was a real warplane. Stearman XA-21, a prototype, never produced. Martin A-22 Maryland. The aircraft is American designed and manufactured, but it primarily saw combat service with the British Royal Air Force, RAF, and the French Air Force. The RAF naming policy for American-built aircraft was to use names associated with their origin, such as naming the Martin Model 167, the Maryland after the company's home state, and the Douglas C-47, the Dakota, and also Douglas A-20 Boston. It was originally designed as the Martin Model 167 for a U.S. Army Air Corps competition for a light bomber. However, France desperately needed aircraft and ordered hundreds. When France fell in 1940, the remaining undelivered aircraft were diverted to the United Kingdom. It flew reconnaissance and bombing missions for the RAF in the Middle East and Mediterranean. The Martin Baltimore was a direct development of the Martin Maryland, specifically redesigned with a deeper fuselage and more powerful engines to meet British requirements. During its early development phase, the design was briefly associated with the A-23 designation when the United States Army Air Forces considered it for domestic use. However, once it was ordered for British and Commonwealth forces under the Lend-Lease Act, it received the official United States Army Air Forces designation A-30. The aircraft was used almost exclusively by the RAF and Commonwealth forces, most notably the SAF and RAF throughout the North African, Western Desert, and Italian campaigns. While the Baltimore was produced in the United States, it was rarely operated by American crews, serving primarily as a vital asset for Allied operations in the Mediterranean and the Balkans. Douglas A-24 Banshee. Here's where it gets interesting. The A-24 was actually the Army Air Corps version of the famous Navy SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The same aircraft that sank multiple Japanese carriers at Midway. The Army version lacked the tail hook for carrier landings and had a few other modifications. It served in the Philippines at the start of the Pacific War and in the Dutch East Indies. Honestly, it wasn't very effective in Army service, partly because the Army didn't have the same doctrines for dive bombing that the Navy had developed, but it's a historic aircraft. Curtiss A-25 Shrike. Similar story, the A-25 was the Army version of the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. The Army ended up not using them much in combat and transferred most to the Marines and other Allied air forces. The Douglas A-26 Invader has the distinction of serving in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, an unusually long combat career for a World War II aircraft. It was a fast, twin-engine attack bomber capable of roughly 355 miles per hour, making it faster than many fighters of its era. The aircraft could carry up to 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns along with bombs and rockets. Crews praised it for its speed, firepower, and handling. After the U.S. Air Force became independent in 1947, the aircraft was redesignated from A-26 to B-26 as part of a post-war reorganization of aircraft categories. This created confusion because the earlier Martin B-26 Marauder already existed, although the Marauder was being retired around the same period. During the Vietnam War, upgraded invaders such as the A-26K Counter-Invader returned to the attack designation and served in night interdiction and counter-insurgency missions. The Invader proved so effective that it remained in combat service for decades after World War II. North American A-27, a variant of the North American NA-69 ordered by Thailand. The US held them back after Thailand fell under Japanese influence. They were eventually used as trainers. The A-28 and A-29 were the US Army Air Force's designations for the Lockheed Hudson, a military derivative of the Super Electra airliner. Originally developed to meet a British requirement for a maritime reconnaissance aircraft, the Hudson was primarily used by the USAAF for coastal patrol, anti-submarine warfare, and transport duties. Although they carried the A-attack designation, they were not attack aircraft in the traditional sense. They lacked the speed and low-level agility of true attack types. Instead, they served as reliable multi-role workhorses. The A-28 utilized Pratt & Whitney engines, while the A-29 used Wright Cyclones. Notably, a USAAF A-29 was responsible for the first U.S. Army sinking of a German U-boat in July 1942. Martin A-30, more British use Baltimores with an American designation. Vultee A-31 and A-35 Vengeance. The Vengeance was a dive bomber that the British requested and the US produced. American crews flew very few of them. The British and Indian Air Forces used the Vengeance quite effectively against Japanese forces in Burma. The terrain in Burma actually made dive bombing more practical than it was in other theaters. The Brewster XA-32 was an experimental attack aircraft developed by Brewster in 1942, a company better known for the troubled F-2A Buffalo fighter. On paper, the XA-32 appeared powerful and heavily armed, but the aircraft proved overweight and suffered from handling and performance problems. Combined with Brewster's growing production and management troubles during the war, the project went nowhere. Douglas A-33, an export version of the Douglas Dauntless sold to Chile, never served with U.S. forces in combat. Brewster A-34, another Brewster prototype, never entered service. We've already covered the A-35 and A-31, so let's move on to our next aircraft. North American A-36 Mustang, the A-36 Apache, sometimes also called the Invader confusingly, was the ground attack and dive bombing version of the famous P-51 Mustang. It had dive brakes. It was stressed for dive bombing, and it was armed with 6 Cal 50 guns plus bombs. The A-36 served primarily in the Mediterranean theater, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and was quite effective. It could dive at steep angles with its brakes deployed and put bombs on target with solid accuracy. Pilots generally liked it though. The dive brakes could cause some vibration. It's a weird historical footnote that the famous P-51 Mustang fighter and the A-36 attack aircraft are essentially the same airframe, different mission, same airplane. The Hughes XA-37 was a proposed experimental attack version of the twin-boom Hughes D-2, developed during 1942 and 1943. The Beechcraft XA-38 Grizzly was a twin-engine powerhouse built around a massive 75mm nose cannon. While it hit impressive speeds of 370 miles per hour, it was doomed by logistics. Its engines were desperately needed for the B-29 Superfortress. Only 2 prototypes were ever built. A 40 and a 41 were attempted heavy single-engine designs, like the massive Vultee XA-41, which proved redundant next to versatile fighters. A 42 to A-45 were a mix of experimental proposals and early jet concepts, like the forward-swept XA-44, that were bypassed as the military pivoted toward the jet age. Here's where the story gets a clean restart. In 1947, when the Air Force became its own branch, the attack category was gradually de-emphasized, and attack roles were increasingly absorbed into fighter and bomber categories. The A-26 became the B-26. Attack aircraft did not disappear from the Air Force lineup, but their role and designation system changed over time. But then in 1962, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara pushed through a unified designation system for all branches. The Navy had been using a totally different system, the SBD, the F4U, the F4H, and so on. All of that got replaced with a unified A-B-F-C system. And critically, many Navy aircraft were converted into the new designation system rather than being completely replaced with redesignations applied to existing aircraft types. This is why the modern A-series doesn't continue from A-45 or wherever the wartime sequence left off. It continues under the unified designation system starting from A1 based on converted and existing aircraft designations. The Douglas Skyraider is the one that started this whole new chapter, and it is genuinely one of the greatest attack aircraft ever built by anyone. Originally designated the AD Skyraider by the Navy, it was redesignated A1 in 1962. The Skyraider was designed during World War II to meet a Navy requirement for a carrier-based dive and torpedo bomber. It first flew in March 1945, just too late for the war it was built for. But then Korea and Vietnam War happened, and the Skyraider turned out to be exactly what those wars needed. Here's the thing about the Skyraider. It was a piston engine, propeller-driven aircraft in the jet age. By the time it was flying over Vietnam in the 1960s, jet fighters had been around for nearly 20 years. The Skyraider looked like it belonged in a different era, and yet it outperformed jets in key close air support roles. It could carry an enormous bomb load up to 8,000 pounds, which was more than a World War II era B-17 Flying Fortress typically carried on long-range missions. It could loiter over the battlefield for hours. It was armored against ground fire, and it was maneuverable at low speed in a way that jets simply weren't. Pilots genuinely loved it. It had multiple hardpoints along its wings, 15 in total on later versions, so it could carry bombs, rockets, napalm, torpedoes, you name it. The pilots called it the SPAD, after the famous World War I fighter, partly affectionately and partly because it was basically flying in a time machine. One of the most famous things the Skyraider ever did happened during the Vietnam War. In 1965, A-1 Skyraiders, slow propeller-driven attack aircraft, shot down one Soviet-built MiG-17 jet fighters in a dogfight. Propeller plane beats jet. It happened. The A-1 also flew legendary rescue escort missions using the Sandy radio call sign, where Skyraiders would fly low and slow over enemy territory for hours, protecting downed pilots from capture, until rescue helicopters could arrive. It was dangerous, it was heroic, and it was exactly the kind of mission no jet could sustain. Over 3,000 Skyraiders were built. They served with the US Navy, US Air Force, and were handed to the South Vietnamese Air Force. The last US Skyraiders retired in the early 1970s, but their legacy is undeniable. The A-2 Savage, originally the A-J Savage, was something you don't see very often, a carrier-based nuclear bomber. Right after World War II, the Navy wanted to be in the nuclear weapons business. The Army Air Force had the B-29 and was developing bigger bombers. The Navy figured that carriers could get nuclear weapons closer to targets than land-based bombers. So they commissioned the Savage, a big hulking aircraft with a mixed piston and jet propulsion system. It had two Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial piston engines in the wings, plus a single Allison J33 turbojet engine in the tail. That's a weird configuration, but it gave range from the pistons and speed from the jet when needed. The Savage first flew in 1948 and entered service in 1950. It was huge for a carrier aircraft, so big that only certain carriers could handle it, and even then it was a logistical headache. On the AJ-1, the wing folding was a manual process that required a crewman to stand on top of the fuselage and operate a portable hydraulic pump. The Savage served through the 1950s into the early 1960s, providing the Navy's first operational carrier-based nuclear strike capability. But it was quickly outpaced by newer jet designs and was replaced by the A-3 Skywarrior beginning in 1957. A-3 Skywarrior Douglas. If the Savage was big, the Skywarrior was enormous. The Douglas A-3 Skywarrior was the heaviest operational aircraft ever to fly from an aircraft carrier, and it earned its nickname instantly, the Whale. The Skywarrior was designed to do the same job as the Savage but better, carry a nuclear weapon from a carrier to a distant target. It first flew in October 1952 and entered fleet service in 1956. It was a high-wing jet bomber with two large turbojets and a crew of 3. At the time, it was the most capable carrier-based strike aircraft in the world. Here's the catch: it had no ejection seats. The designers made a weight-saving decision to delete them, reasoning that most missions would be at high altitude. The crews were not thrilled about this, and the aircraft gained the morbid nickname All Three Dead for the same initials, ATD. Wait, some people said it stood for All Three Die? Yeah. It wasn't exactly a popular decision. The Douglas A-3 Skywarrior did have ejection seats in early production models. Despite that, the Skywarrior had a long and versatile career. Its strategic bombing role actually faded fairly quickly. The Navy shifted nuclear deterrence to submarine-launched Polaris missiles in the early 1960s, which rendered carrier-based nuclear bombers. But the A-3 airframe proved incredibly adaptable. It became a tanker, an electronic warfare platform, a reconnaissance aircraft, and eventually served until 1991, more than 35 years in service. The EA-3B electronic reconnaissance variant flew combat missions in the Gulf War. A-4 Skyhawk Douglas. Oh, this one is special. The Douglas A-4 Skyhawk might be the most elegant attack aircraft ever built. In the early 1950s, the Navy wanted a replacement for the Skyraider. The Navy wanted a lightweight, carrier-based jet attack aircraft in the early 1950s. Ed Heinemann designed the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk to be much lighter and simpler than expected, around 15,000 to 16,000 pounds, prioritizing efficiency over complexity. It had small swept wings that did not need folding for carrier storage, and was designed to be compact, fast, and highly maneuverable. It first flew in 1954, and was such a success that it remained in production for 25 years, with the final aircraft delivered in 1979. The Douglas A-4 Skyhawk did not participate in the Korean War. It entered service after, but it was everywhere in Vietnam. Navy and Marine Skyhawks flew thousands of sorties over North Vietnam. It was the workhorse of carrier aviation through the 1960s and 1970s. It was also famously flown by the Blue Angels for over a decade. What made the Skyhawk so beloved was that it was honest. What you put in, you got out. The aircraft also had a surprisingly long export career. Israel used it extensively in the 1967 and 1973 wars, and Argentina flew them in the Falklands conflict in 1982. In the Falklands, Argentine Skyhawk pilots conducted daring low-level attacks that resulted in the sinking of several British warships, including HMS Coventry and HMS Ardent. The A-4 finally left U.S. Navy service in 2003, but it's still flying in some air forces today. If the Skyhawk was elegant, the A-5 Vigilante was ambitious. Almost uncomfortably ambitious. North American Aviation began designing the Vigilante in response to a 1953 Navy requirement for a carrier-based supersonic nuclear strike aircraft. The idea was a carrier-based aircraft that could fly at Mach 2 while carrying a nuclear bomb. That was a breathtaking goal. The Vigilante that emerged was a massive, swept-wing, twin-engine supersonic aircraft. It was the first bomber to use a digital computer for navigation. It had an innovative internal weapons bay where the nuclear bomb would be ejected rearward through a tube in the tail alongside auxiliary fuel tanks. The goal was to allow the aircraft to out-ruin the bomb at supersonic speeds, but the weapon often got caught in the aircraft's wake and tumbled dangerously behind the tail. The A-5 Vigilante entered service in 1961 as a carrier-based supersonic nuclear strike aircraft. It flew at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. The Navy set several altitude and speed records with it. It was genuinely impressive technology, but almost immediately, the strategic mission evaporated. The Navy moved its nuclear deterrent to ballistic missile submarines, and the Vigilante found itself an expensive solution to a problem that no longer existed. Rather than retire it, the Navy converted it to the RA-5C, a fast reconnaissance aircraft. In that role, it actually served quite usefully over Vietnam, though it suffered heavy losses. Because the RA-5C had to fly steady, low to medium altitude paths to capture clear photographs, it was highly vulnerable to North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire. Navy lost 27 Vigilantes, the highest loss rate of any Navy aircraft in the war. The RA-5C finally retired in 1979, and with it went one of the most technically extraordinary aircraft the Navy ever flew. A-6 Intruder Grumman. After the Vigilante's supersonic ambition, the Intruder went in the exact opposite direction. It was subsonic. It was ugly. It had a fuselage shaped vaguely like a slightly squashed cylinder, and it was absolutely devastating. Grumman designed the A-6 Intruder in the late 1950s for a specific mission: all-weather, nighttime, low-level attack. The idea was to have an aircraft that could fly below enemy radar in the dark in any weather and put weapons exactly on target. The Intruder was built around a sophisticated digital navigation and attack system, again extremely advanced for the early 1960s. It entered service in 1963 and immediately became the backbone of Navy attack aviation. It could carry more bombs than an A-4. It could find targets the A-4 couldn't find at night or in bad weather, and it was tough. The side-by-side seating for pilot and bombardier navigator was unusual, but allowed both crew members to share workload effectively. Over Vietnam, A-6 Intruders flew some of the most difficult missions of the war. Single aircraft penetrations at low altitude into heavily defended North Vietnam at night. The losses were real and painful, but the missions were accomplished. The Intruder was so good that it kept serving for over 30 years. The A-6E, the ultimate variant, incorporated a laser targeting system and could carry precision-guided weapons with remarkable accuracy. It flew in the 1986 strikes against Libya, in the Gulf War of 1991, and in various other operations right up until its retirement in 1997. A variant of the Intruder, the EA-6B Prowler, became the Navy's dedicated electronic warfare aircraft, jamming enemy radars and air defenses. The Prowler served even longer, staying in fleet service until 2019. The Intruder represents the peak of the traditional carrier attack aircraft concept, a dedicated, purpose-built aircraft optimized entirely for putting weapons on ground targets. After the Intruder, the Navy moved toward multi-role fighters that could do everything, and there has never been a direct successor. A-7 Corsair II. Now, the A-7 has an interesting origin story. In the early 1960s, the Navy looked at how expensive the A-5 Vigilante was and how much the A-6 Intruder cost, and they decided they also needed a cheaper light attack aircraft. Something to replace the A-4 Skyhawk eventually, but at an affordable price. LTV Ling Temco Vought won the contract by doing something clever. They basically took their existing F-8 Crusader fighter design, removed the variable incidence wing feature, put in a more fuel-efficient non-afterburning turbofan engine, and optimized it entirely for attack. Reusing an existing design kept development costs way down. The A-7 Corsair II, named after the famous World War II Vought F-4U Corsair, first flew in 1965 and entered service in 1967. It went to Vietnam almost immediately. What surprised everybody was how accurate it was. The A-7E, the main production variant, had an advanced navigation and weapons delivery system that made it one of the most precise bombers in the world at the time. Crews could put bombs exactly where they wanted them consistently. The Air Force liked it so much they ordered their own version, the A-7D, which actually had a more powerful engine than the Navy version. The Air Force A-7D served through the 1980s with the Air National Guard. In the Gulf War of 1991, Navy A-7s flew some of the first combat missions before being retired shortly after. The Corsair II served for nearly 25 years, a solid, dependable aircraft that never got quite the recognition it deserved because it wasn't glamorous. A-8 skipped. Under the 1962 tri-service system, A-8 was technically skipped. The AV-8 Harrier, the famous British jump jet used by the US Marine Corps, took the 8 slot but under the V prefix for VTOL aircraft, becoming AV-8 rather than A-8. There was also a never formalized proposal by General Dynamics in the 1960s, sometimes referred to as the A-8, but it never received an official designation. So A-8 is essentially an empty slot. Northrop YA-9, and now we get to one of the great what-if stories in military aviation. In the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was still raging, and the Air Force was watching close air support aircraft get shot up trying to support ground troops. They decided they needed a purpose-built close air support aircraft that was specifically designed to survive over a modern battlefield. The program was called AX for Attack Experimental. Several companies submitted proposals. The Air Force selected 2 to build flying prototypes, Northrop with the YA-9 and Fairchild Republic with the YA-10. These 2 aircraft would fly against each other and one would win the contract. The Northrop YA-9 first flew on May 30th, 1972. It was a conventional-looking aircraft with the engines mounted at the rear of the fuselage. A sleek design, more traditional than the eventual winner. Northrop test pilots praised its handling. It met all the Air Force's requirements. The fly-off between the YA-9 and the competing YA-10 took place between October and December 1972. Both aircraft were evaluated extensively by Air Force pilots. The verdict came on January 18, 1973, and Northrop lost. The YA-10 was selected. The margin between them apparently wasn't massive, but the YA-10 used an established engine, the General Electric TF-34, which was already in service on the Navy's S-3 Viking. That reduced risk. And Fairchild Republic was a company in genuine financial trouble that might not have survived without the contract. Those factors likely influenced the decision. Both prototypes survive. One is at the Marchfield Air Museum in California. It's a footnote, but an important one. So now, let's talk about the winner. The A-10, the Warthog, the tank killer, the flying gun, and honestly, one of the most beloved aircraft in the history of the United States military. The A-10 Thunderbolt II won the AX competition in January 1973 and entered service in 1976. It was designed around the most powerful aircraft cannon ever put into a production military aircraft, the XA-2 Avenger, a 7-barreled rotary cannon firing 30mm depleted uranium shells at 3,900 rounds per minute. The gun is so large and so heavy that the entire nose of the aircraft was essentially designed around it. The XA-2 is bigger than a Volkswagen Beetle. But the A-10 isn't just about the gun, even though the gun gets all the attention. The aircraft was designed from the ground up to survive. The cockpit is enclosed in a titanium bathtub that can withstand 23mm cannon fire. The flight controls have redundant hydraulic systems, so if one gets shot out, the pilot still has control. The engines are mounted high on the rear fuselage, away from ground fire. The aircraft can fly on just one engine. It can even fly with hydraulics completely shot out, using manual reversion controls. During the Cold War, the A-10's job was to stop Soviet tank columns from pouring through the Fulda Gap in Germany. Then the Cold War ended and people started questioning whether the A-10 was still needed. That conversation has been going on ever since. And every time the Air Force tries to retire the Warthog, something happens to remind everyone why it's irreplaceable. In the Gulf War of 1991, A-10s destroyed more Iraqi vehicles than any other aircraft. They flew over 8,000 missions, destroyed over 900 tanks, 926 artillery pieces, 1,355 combat vehicles. During the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, the Warthog became the Air Force aircraft most requested by troops in contact. The sound of those twin turbofans and that cannon firing has a psychological effect on enemy troops that is genuinely difficult to quantify. The A-10 is now scheduled to be retired by 2029. The Air Force has been trying to get rid of it for years because it's expensive to maintain and vulnerable to modern air defenses. Whether that actually happens remains to be seen. Soldiers on the ground tend to feel very strongly about the Warthog. The A-10 is the last dedicated ground attack aircraft in the US Air Force. When it goes, there won't be another one like it. A-11 was a designation that was explored but never formally assigned in the modern system. The A-12 Avenger II, however, is one of the most dramatic and painful stories in American defense procurement history. In 1983, the Navy started the Advanced Tactical Aircraft program. They needed a replacement for the A-6 Intruder. Whatever replaced it had to use stealth technology. This was the era of the F-117 Nighthawk and the B-2 Spirit, and stealth was the future. Two teams competed, McDonnell Douglas with General Dynamics and Northrop with Grumman and Vought. In January 1988, the McDonnell Douglas General Dynamics team was selected. The Navy wanted 620 of them. The Marines wanted another 238. The Air Force planned to buy an additional 400 as a replacement for the F-111. The A-12 Avenger II, named after the World War II torpedo bomber, was going to be a flying wing design, shaped like a perfect isosceles triangle. Because of this shape, it almost immediately picked up the nickname the Flying Dorito. It was designed to be stealthy, all-weather, carrier-capable, and able to carry precision weapons internally. On paper, it sounded extraordinary. And then everything went wrong. The composite materials used in the wing were harder to work with than anticipated. The aircraft was coming in massively overweight, 30% heavier than specified. The radar systems were behind schedule, costs were exploding, and critically, the contractors kept telling the government everything was under control when it wasn't. In December 1990, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney asked the Navy and the contractors to justify why the program shouldn't be canceled. The response was not convincing. On January 7, 1991, Cheney killed the program. Not a single A-12 ever flew. The entire program had consumed approximately $5 billion with nothing to show for it. The legal fallout lasted over 2 decades. The government demanded the contractors repay $2 billion. McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics fought it in court. The case went to the US Supreme Court. A settlement wasn't finally reached until 2014, 23 years after the cancellation. The cancellation of the A-12 was the largest contract termination in Department of Defense history at the time. It left the Navy without a replacement for the A-6 Intruder and is widely considered one of the key financial wounds that weakened McDonnell Douglas and eventually forced its merger into Boeing. The only physical remnant is a single full-size mock-up, which is on display at the Fort Worth Aviation Museum in Texas. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe because there's a lot more aviation history coming. If you want to watch the F-Series aircraft from F-1 to F-35, click here, or F-100 to F-117, click here.